Howdy, with this video, I want to go over the schedule real quickly, which I kind of always do with these videos. Then talk kind of about what we're getting into with the readings for this week. Uh, Doing this video on Tuesday, January 29th. Northeast State's closed. I'm in my daughter's room. It's probably some trophies behind me. They don't give me trophies for dancing. Usually I'm asked to leave an establishment if I start dancing. Um, a little bit different look there, I guess. With the readings this week, with the schedule for tonight, the 29th, you should be posting your blog number 2 on Journal Portfolio. Again, just like last time, just taking the graded one I sent, revising accordingly, and then posting. Make sure you set it to allow comments. On Thursday, the 31st, you should be responding to 2 people's blog posts, and I'll send those out later today, or the assignments there for that. Then on Saturday, going to be completing blog number 3, putting that in D2L, and hopefully starting to think about that first essay. We are going to meet with Felicia Hankins on next Monday, February 4th. That's at 2 o'clock in room H233 upstairs in the Humanities Building. Have to think about that for a second. And that is required, so make sure you're making plans to attend that. I'm not sure how long it'll go. We've scheduled it for 2 to 4:30. I don't know if it'll go 2.5 hours. That's a long time. But we do meet at 2 on February 4th there. For the readings this week, you're going to notice kind of a shift in the way people are seeing the world. But what they're going to do is they're going to take some of these Enlightenment ideas and kind of run with them a little bit in ways maybe the Enlightenment folks didn't imagine. Uh, Particularly this idea that truth kind of resides within the individual to some extent. Some of you know in your blog posts are kind of pointed out some of the problems there. About the individual being kind of the keeper of the truth. With enlightenment, you used your reason and intellect and attempted to figure out the world through science and apprehend God and truth that way by looking at kind of the natural world, so to speak. The romantics are going to take that idea and keep going with it a little bit. But as we discuss these different ideas, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them, obviously. But hopefully, you're going to notice you've been influenced by them to some extent. It's kind of interesting. With Kierkegaard, he's going to pick up on that Socratic daemon idea. Let me get over to your. Oops, not where I want to be there. But also be sure to note on the class schedule, you're not reading this entire book, just from 157 to 167, using the pagination in the PDF file there. So you're going to start. My mouse didn't want to work here. With the actualization of the view, where he starts talking about the daemon of Socrates. And what he's really going to get to is this idea of Socrates that you got to know yourself, that the unexamined life is not worth living, that the truths that individuals develop are very important, maybe even more important than those of the state, depending on what that inner voice is starting to say to you and how it's starting to work out in your life. But you're just going to read the next 10 pages there up to page 167. And what you're going to notice is Kierkegaard gets into this idea of Socrates' truth being the subjective truth, this inward subjective truth that leads to a certain type of freedom. That one, it does put you in opposition, or could put you in opposition to the religious establishments, the laws and the ideas of the state that are often in opposition to us, right? In some ways. And what Kierkegaard's kind of getting at is, where does truth really lie? And he's going to keep pushing this idea that truth lies within the individual. And that produces a lot of angst and anxiety. But it also pushes us towards a certain subjective freedom that allows us to see things, beyond just what the state says or what the religious institutions say. And we can come up with our own better concept of truth. And what this does, it kind of pits into competition, this universal versus the individual. He's coming out of this tradition of the Enlightenment. You can see it's a super thick writing, right? It's like, wow, how I couldn't imagine reading an entire book of his and without my ears bleeding a little bit. But he's responding to some pretty serious philosophers, particularly with Hegel, the dominant German philosopher of the time. But if you keep going with Kierkegaard, he's going to be in opposition to other Danish philosophers, particularly Martinson. He's also kind of fighting with another big guy named Kant, Immanuel Kant. So he's being very careful with his writing. And kind of taking it step by step, and very carefully, because he has to, because he's responding to a lot of different ideas here. Um, but he's going to start getting in some of these romantic ideas uh, about how we should not just accept what we've been told by the state or by religious authorities. We're not really built to just accept universal laws because we have our own minds, and why have your own conscience and your own ability to discern truth if you're just going to follow whatever you've been told in the past. And it gets real complicated, and you probably just sitting there, watching this, you're thinking, there's some problems there, aren't there? And yeah, because if we all, just work within our own inner version of truth, and um, what starts happening uh, to the truth, so to speak. But he also has kind of a powerful point. Often, no matter what kind of external input you have, the individual still has to filter all that out and arrive at some version of truth that may be different from everybody else. Even other people sitting in the same church or the same Congress or whatever. It's a very, very fascinating concept, and the Romantics are going to start running with this in quite powerful ways. To kind of get a sense of what Kierkegaard's pushing towards, he uses the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis chapter 22. If you remember, God, Isaac's Abraham's, and the Bible says his only son is his second son because Ishmael comes first. But anyway, we're not going there. But Ishmael's the son he's had with Sarah. It's taken him forever. They're elderly folks by the time they have Isaac. So kind of almost a miracle baby. But God says to Abraham, "I want you to sacrifice Isaac, as a testimony to your faith to me." And Abraham proceeds to do that. He grabs a couple of guys and some wood, takes Isaac to the place where God wants him to be sacrificed, tells the other two guys to stay behind, goes up to the place. So in one sense, Abraham knows he's doing something that's not within the cultural norm, right? If he brought the other two people with him, they'd have probably tried to stop him, like most of us would if we saw somebody trying to kill their son. But if you remember, Abraham ties up Isaac, gets him on the sacrificial area there, puts the wood on top of him, and he's ready to kill him. And an angel, just at the very last second, kind of swoops in and kind of stops him from doing that. What Kierkegaard gets at is that there's really no rational explanation for what Abraham's tried to do. It violates all the universal laws that are in place. It's basically murder. We generally don't we frown on people who stab their children and set them on fire, right? But there's a higher truth going on there. Something that Abraham is inside Abraham. It's internal. It's not something he could explain to anybody else, really. If you listen to preaching on this passage, it's quite often unsatisfactory. They can't quite explain what Abraham must have been thinking and feeling and dealing with as he committed this act, which ultimately turned out to be something God approved of. Which brings some interesting questions about God, but this is not a theology class, and I'm certainly no theologian there. But that's kind of this kind of internal battle and struggle and understanding. That's kind of says this is what Kierkegaard says we should be involved in. If it puts us in opposition to the state, like it did with Socrates, so be it. We're probably just breaking down false realities anyway. So it gets deep, right, and thick and icky and difficult. So sometimes if you're reading these folks and you're kind of like, wow, this is one that's kind of heavy, and it's it's a little foreign to you a little bit. It's part of the romantic kind of ideology. You're going to see much more happier. Kierkegaard's trying to figure all this out within terms of Christianity. Emerson, the American version of Romanticism with people like Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman. Feel a little more freedom with this kind of idea that truth is within oneself. And you're going to see that with Emerson. Again, we're just reading the first 9 paragraphs of Self-Reliance. If you want to read the whole thing, that's fine. Emerson tends to be a little bit repetitive, at least in my opinion. But the readings for this week are going to kind of focus on that, focus on the individual, upon our inner worlds. An idea of like Frederick Douglass's narrative is going to focus on this idea that every African American's an individual created by God with all the same feelings and thoughts and emotions that everybody else has. How can slavery possibly exist within this reality? When we start getting to the creative fiction, we're gonna be. Won't let me highlight very well here. Something like The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen, another Danish writer. Kierkegaard's a Copenhagener. I'm not sure what you call someone from Copenhagen. A Copenhagener, Copenhagenist. Anyway, Kierkegaard's from Copenhagen, and Andersen's also Danish. And you're going to notice with The Little Mermaid, he's creating this fantasy world and this alternate reality where we're supposed to learn something by the end of it. And you're going to see this move with the romantics of this emphasis on the creative, on the imagination, on the emotions, and things like this. And ultimately, by the time you get to the Romantic poets, this emphasis on symbols and internal meaning and things like this, but also protesting the events that your book talks about in the reading for today as well, some of the political upheavals and the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about later in the week. But I want to kind of give a brief introduction to Kierkegaard. It's very difficult. 10 pages is generally enough for most students. But he's a fascinating guy trying to get at a very interesting way of looking at the world. And hopefully, maybe from our modern perspective, we're a little more open to something like Kierkegaard. This idea that each individual carries has to decide the truth for themselves is not that uncommon with a lot of modern philosophies and beliefs. But you can kind of get, hopefully, kind of get a sense of where we might go with the first essay. This question of where does truth reside, or how do we apprehend truth, and how is that represented in the various some of the literature we've read so far. Might be kind of a good topic to work towards. So make sure you're thinking about that as we read this week. But other than that, I'm going to get off here. If you have questions, be sure and let me know. Not snowing much at my house, but if it snowed a lot at your house, be safe. Be warm. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.